The morning alarm echoed through the gray dormitory halls of New Seoul Colony like it had for the past 15 years. Kim Dae rolled out of his narrow bunk and pulled on his work clothes. Blue coveralls, steel-toed boots, and the mandatory identification badge that marked him as Human Worker Class 7. Outside his small window, the twin suns of Kepler 442b were rising over the industrial landscape of smokestacks and mining towers. Dae walked through the corridors alongside hundreds of other human workers. Their faces showed the same tired acceptance that came from years of routine. The Valeth Empire had ruled this world for 3 generations now. Most humans had grown up knowing nothing else. The factory floor stretched out like a metal ocean. Atmospheric processors hummed in perfect rows, each one the size of a small building. These machines kept the colony's air breathable, filtering out the toxic gases that naturally filled this planet's atmosphere. Dae knew every bolt and wire in these machines. He had been fixing them since he was 18 years old. "Worker Kim Dae, report to Processing Unit 7, came the voice over the speakers. The words were spoken in perfect human language, but the accent was distinctly Valeth. Their alien overseers had learned to speak like humans, but they could never quite hide their true nature. Dae grabbed his toolkit and walked across the factory floor. Processing Unit 7 was acting up again. The same problem it had been having for weeks. A simple fix that would take him maybe 20 minutes. But Dae had learned to make simple fixes take much longer. The extra time gave him opportunities to think and plan. As he worked on the machine, Dae thought about the book hidden in his locker. It was a small, worn copy of The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. He had found it 3 months ago in the ruins of an old human settlement. Valeth had missed it during their regular sweeps. The Valeth Empire had banned all human literature 40 years ago. They called it dangerous propaganda. They said human stories promoted rebellion and individual thinking. The punishment for possessing human books was death. Not just for the person who owned them, but for their entire family. But Dae could not stop reading. He had discovered that human stories contained something the Valeth feared. They showed that humans were capable of great things. Love, sacrifice, courage, hope. The Valeth wanted humans to believe they were nothing more than workers and servants. The books proved otherwise. "Hey Dae, you need help over there?" Park Soo-jin walked over from her supervisor station. She was one of the few humans who had been promoted to a management position. The Valeth trusted her because she followed every rule perfectly. What they did not know was that Soo-jin had been a university literature professor before the occupation. "Just the usual problems," Dae replied quietly. "This unit needs a complete overhaul, but they want us to keep patching it." Soo-jin nodded and pretended to examine his work. As she leaned closer, she whispered, "I have 3 people who are interested in our reading material. All trusted. All hungry for knowledge." Dae continued working while he processed this information. 3 new readers meant 3 more people who might discover what humans were truly capable of. It also meant 3 more people who could be caught and executed. "Set up the usual meeting," he whispered back. "Maintenance Tunnel C after the night shift." Soo-jin walked away without another word. To any watching Valeth, it had looked like a normal workplace conversation between a supervisor and a worker. The day continued like every other day. Dae fixed machines, filled out reports, and ate his regulation lunch in the worker cafeteria. But underneath the routine, he was planning. Tonight he would meet with his small network of book smugglers. After his shift ended, Dae made his way through the colony's underground maintenance tunnels. These tunnels connected every building in New Seoul Colony. The Valeth rarely came down here unless there was an emergency. It was the perfect place for secret meetings. He found Lee Woo waiting in Tunnel C. Woo worked as a starship mechanic at the colony's spaceport. He was a thin man with quick hands and an even quicker mind. More importantly, he had access to the cargo ships that traveled between star systems. "I modified another cargo hold this week," Woo reported quietly. "Built a hidden compartment behind the fuel tanks, big enough for maybe 50 books. 50 books, Dae repeated. That could reach a lot of people. Choi Mi-young arrived next. She worked in the communication center, monitoring radio signals and data transmissions. Her job was supposed to help the Valeth catch smugglers and rebels. Instead, she used her position to help them avoid capture. The Valeth are increasing their sweeps, Mi-young warned. They found another family with banned books last week. The whole family was executed in the town square yesterday. Dae felt his stomach tighten. The Kang family. He had given them that book, a simple collection of Korean folk tales that had somehow survived the purges. Now they were dead because they wanted to remember their culture. We cannot stop, Dae said firmly. Every book we save, every person who reads them makes their sacrifice worthwhile. Soo-jin was the last to arrive. She looked around the tunnel carefully before speaking. I have been thinking about expanding our operation. There are sympathetic people on other worlds. Some of them are not even human. This was dangerous talk. The Valeth Empire included dozens of alien species. Most of them supported the human suppression policies. But Soo-jin had always been good at reading people. Are you sure we can trust non-humans? Wu asked. I know a Valeth bureaucrat who works in the cultural ministry, Soo-jin explained. He has been asking strange questions about human literature, why it was banned, what made it so dangerous. I think he might be curious enough to help us. Dae considered this carefully. Working with aliens would make their operation much more dangerous. But it could also make it much more powerful. If they could get Valeth citizens to read human books, it might change how the entire empire viewed humanity. Set up a careful meeting, Dae decided. But we test him first. Give him something small and safe. See how he reacts. The 4 conspirators spent the next hour planning their next shipment. Wu would take a cargo ship to the mining colonies in the Outer Rim. Hidden in his modified compartments would be 25 books. Classics like To Kill a Mockingbird in 1984 and The Diary of Anne Frank. Stories that showed both the worst and best of human nature. Mi-young would monitor Valeth communications to make sure their route was safe. Soo-jin would identify new readers among the miners, and Dae would continue his day job, fixing machines, and pretending to be just another obedient worker. As they prepared to leave, Dae pulled out the copy of The Grapes of Wrath from his toolkit. This one goes to the mining colony on Kepler 438. There is a human supervisor there who lost his son to Valeth labor policies. I think he is ready to remember what we are capable of. The others nodded. They understood that they were not just smuggling books. They were smuggling hope. They were reminding humans across the galaxy that they had once been free, creative, and powerful. And maybe, if they were very careful and very lucky, they could help humans become those things again. The meeting ended, and the 4 rebels disappeared back into the tunnels. Above them, the Valeth Empire continued its rule, unaware that in the darkness below, a quiet revolution was growing stronger with every book that changed hands. Dae returned to his dormitory and laid down on his narrow bunk. Tomorrow would bring another day of fixing machines and following orders, but tonight he would read. Tonight he would remember what it meant to be human. And tomorrow night, he would help others remember too. The revolution had begun not with weapons or bombs, but with words on pages. And Dae knew that sometimes words could be the most powerful weapons of all. 3 months had passed since Li Wu's first book run to the Outer Rim mining colonies. The operation had been a complete success. Not a single book was discovered, and the miners had passed them around like precious treasures. Now Dae was receiving messages through secret channels asking for more books, many more books. The demand was growing faster than they had ever expected. Dae stood in the factory's supply room, pretending to count spare parts while actually reading a coded message from the mining colony on Kepler 438. The supervisor there, a man named Hong Gil, was requesting anything by Maya Angelou. His workers had finished reading I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings and were hungry for more stories about overcoming hardship. Worker Kim, what are you doing in here? The voice made Dae jump. He quickly hid the message and turned to face Overseer Vexkar, a tall Valeth with the typical gray skin and 4 arms that marked his species. Just checking our inventory of atmospheric filters, sir. Unit 12 needs a replacement by tomorrow. Vexkar stared at Dae with his large black eyes. The Valeth could see better than humans in low light, and Day always felt like those eyes could see right through him. After a long moment, the overseer nodded and walked away. Day's heart was still racing when he left the supply room. The Valeth were becoming more suspicious. Last week, they had started random searches of worker lockers. They claimed they were looking for stolen factory equipment, but Day knew they were really hunting for books. That evening, Day met with his team in a different location. They had stopped using the maintenance tunnels after Mi-young warned them that Valeth Security was installing new sensors down there. Now they met in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the colony. "We have a problem," Mi-young announced as soon as everyone arrived. "Valeth Intelligence has created a special task force. They are calling it the Cultural Purity Division. Their job is to find and stop what they call the literary insurgency." "Literary insurgency?" Sujin laughed, but there was no humor in it. "They make us sound like dangerous criminals." "We are dangerous to them," Day replied. "Every person who reads these books starts to think differently. They start to question why humans are treated like servants." Wu nodded grimly. "I heard something interesting at the spaceport yesterday. One of the Valeth cargo inspectors was asking about human poetry. He wanted to know what made it different from Valeth literature." This was unexpected news. The Valeth had their own art forms, but they were focused on duty and order. Human poetry talked about love, dreams, and freedom, concepts that the Valeth Empire tried to suppress. "Maybe we should try to reach some of the Valeth," Sujin suggested. "If they are curious about our literature, maybe they can be convinced that humans deserve better treatment." It was a dangerous idea. Working with aliens could expose their entire operation, but it could also change everything. "I might have a contact," Sujin continued. "There is a low-level bureaucrat in the cultural ministry named Keth 9. He has been asking questions about why human books were banned. Careful questions, but persistent ones." Dee thought about this for a long moment. "Set up a meeting, but we test him first. Give him something that will not get us all killed if he reports it." 2 weeks later, Sujin arranged to accidentally bump into Keth 9 in the colony's central market. She dropped a small book from her shopping bag and he picked it up for her. The book was a collection of short stories by Ray Bradbury, nothing that directly criticized the Valeth Empire, but stories that showed the power of human imagination. Keth 9 stared at the book's cover for several seconds before handing it back. "These human writings," he said quietly, "are they really as dangerous as our leaders claim?" "Why don't you read one and decide for yourself?" Sujin replied, then walked away quickly. 3 days later, she found a note in her locker at work. "The stories about Mars made me think about my own world differently. Do you have more?" Meanwhile, the book smuggling operation was expanding beyond anything Day had imagined. Wu had recruited 2 other mechanics to help modify cargo ships. They now had hidden compartments on vessels traveling to 12 different star systems. Each shipment carried 50 to 75 books. The miners were not the only ones reading. Factory workers were passing books from shift to shift. Service. Staff in the government buildings were finding ways to read during their breaks. Even some of the human supervisors who had always followed Valeth rules perfectly were starting to ask questions. But success brought new dangers. One morning, Day arrived at work to find the factory surrounded by Valeth security forces. They had arrested a worker named Park Min for possessing a copy of Fahrenheit 451. The irony was not lost on anyone. A book about burning books had led to another arrest. "This is the 6th arrest this month," Mi-young reported at their next meeting. "They are getting closer to finding our network." "We need to be smarter," Day replied. "Smaller groups, more careful distribution, and we need to start training people to hide books better." Sujin had more encouraging news. "Keth 9 has read 6 books now. He especially liked 1984 and Animal Farm. He says they remind him of things he sees in his own government." "Is he ready to help us?" Wu asked. "Maybe. But he is scared. He knows what happens to Valeth who question the Empire. They disappear just like humans do." Despite the increasing danger, the books continued to spread. Day received reports from colonies he had never even heard of. Human workers were copying books by hand when they could not get printed copies. They were memorizing poems and stories to share with others. The most surprising report came from the industrial world called Vega 7. The human workers there had convinced some of their alien co-workers to read human literature. A group of Thelian laborers had read To Kill a Mockingbird and started asking why humans were treated differently than other species. It is working, Day told his team. Not just with humans, but with other aliens too. The books are making them think. But the Valeth Empire was thinking too. Commander Thexvar of Valeth Intelligence had been assigned to lead the Cultural Purity Division. He was smart, ruthless, and completely dedicated to stopping the spread of human literature. Mi Young intercepted communications showing that Thexvar was planning something called Operation Silent Page. The details were encrypted, but the name suggested a massive crackdown on book smuggling. We need to warn everyone, Day decided. All our contacts, all our readers. Tell them to hide their books better and be extra careful. The warning went out through their secret network, but they all knew it might not be enough. The Valeth Empire had vast resources and advanced technology. The book smugglers had only their dedication and the power of the stories they carried. As Day walked home from the meeting, he thought about all the people who were reading human books across the galaxy. Miners on distant worlds were learning about courage from Harper Lee. Factory workers were discovering hope in the words of Maya Angelou. Even some aliens were beginning to understand that humans were more than just laborers and servants. The seeds of doubt had been planted in minds across dozens of worlds. The question now was whether those seeds could grow fast enough to survive the storm that was coming. Back in his dormitory, Day pulled out his latest acquisition. It was a worn copy of the Diary of Anne Frank that had somehow survived 40 years of Valeth book burnings. As he read about a young girl's hope during humanity's darkest hour, he felt his own hope growing stronger. The Empire might have weapons and ships and armies, but they did not have what humans had always possessed in abundance, the power to dream of something better. And sometimes dreams could change the galaxy. The alarm sirens began wailing at dawn. Day woke to the sound of heavy boots marching through the dormitory corridors and Valeth voices shouting orders in their harsh language. Through his small window, he could see armored vehicles surrounding every building in New Sol Colony. Operation Silent Page had begun. Day quickly grabbed the 3 books hidden in his locker and stuffed them inside his work coveralls. He had to get them out of the dormitory before the searches began. As he stepped into the corridor, he saw dozens of his fellow workers being dragged from their rooms by Valeth soldiers. All human workers report to the main assembly area immediately, announced a voice over the speakers. Anyone found in their quarters after 10 minutes will be considered a fugitive. The assembly area was the factory's main floor. Thousands of human workers stood in neat rows while Valeth soldiers surrounded them with weapons drawn. At the front of the crowd, Commander Thexvar stood on a raised platform. He was taller than most Valeth, with darker gray skin and scars across his face that marked him as a veteran of many battles. Human workers of New Sol Colony, Thexvar announced, his voice echoing through the vast space. For too long, dangerous, criminals among you have been spreading illegal propaganda. This ends today. Behind him, a large screen displayed images of confiscated books. Day recognized many of them. The Great Gatsby, Pride and Prejudice, The Color Purple. Each book represented hours of careful smuggling and the risk of lives. These materials promote rebellion against the natural order, Thexvar continued. They fill your minds with impossible dreams and dangerous ideas. Today we will cleanse this colony of their poison. The commander gestured to a group of soldiers who began wheeling in metal barrels. The smell of fuel filled the air. They were preparing for a public book burning. Anyone who provides information about the smuggling network will be rewarded, Thexvar announced. Anyone who continues to hide these criminals will share their punishment. Day felt the books pressed against his chest and tried to keep his face calm. Around him, other workers were doing the same. He could see the fear in their eyes, but also something else. Determination. The books had changed them. They were no longer just obedient servants. The searches began immediately after the assembly. Soldiers tore apart dormitory rooms, workstations, and even the cafeteria. They found books hidden in air vents, inside machinery, and even buried in the small gardens some workers maintained behind the buildings. By evening, they had arrested 47 people. Day watched through his dormitory window as trucks carried away his fellow workers. Among them was young Han Jun, barely 20 years old, who had joined their network just 2 months ago. Jun had been caught with a copy of The Catcher in the Rye hidden inside his toolkit. The public burning began. At sunset, hundreds of books were thrown into the metal barrels as flames reached toward the darkening sky. HFY had forced all the workers to watch. He wanted them to see what happened to dangerous ideas. But the plan backfired in a way the commander never expected. As the flames consumed Anne of Green Gables and Lord of the Flies, many of the watching humans began to cry. Not from fear, but from grief. They were watching their dreams burn. Their hopes for something better than endless servitude were turning to ash. Then something remarkable happened. A young human girl, maybe 8 years old, stepped forward from the crowd. She was the daughter of one of the maintenance supervisors. In a clear, strong voice, she began to recite words that Day recognized from the Diary of Anne Frank. In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. The soldiers moved to stop her, but more voices joined in. Workers, who had memorized poems and passages, began reciting them. Do not go gentle into that good night. I have a dream. We hold these truths to be self-evident. The Valeth could burn the books, but they could not burn the words that lived in human hearts and minds. HFY was furious. He ordered the crowd dispersed and declared a colony-wide curfew. But the damage was done. The book burning had not intimidated the humans. It had united them. Over the following weeks, the crackdown intensified. Mi Young was arrested when Valeth security traced some of her communication intercepts. Li Wu was captured attempting to deliver books to a mining station in the asteroid belt. His hidden cargo compartments were discovered, and he was tortured for information about the smuggling network. Su Jin went into hiding after her identity was compromised. A co-worker had reported seeing her with suspicious materials. She now lived in the abandoned sectors of the colony, moving from hiding place to hiding place. But even as the original network crumbled, something unexpected was happening across the galaxy. The books had already done their work. Human workers on dozens of worlds were no longer waiting for smuggled copies. They were writing their own. On the mining world of Kepler 438, Supervisor Hong Gil had started an underground newspaper filled with quotes from human literature. The free voice was copied by hand and passed from worker to worker. The Valeth authorities could not stop it because new copies appeared faster than they could confiscate them. On the industrial planet Vega 7, the Thelian workers who had read To Kill a Mockingbird were now openly questioning why humans were paid less than other species for the same work. Their protests were peaceful, but persistent. Most surprisingly, reports were coming in of Valeth citizens who were secretly reading human books. Keth9 had not been the only one curious about human literature. Bureaucrats, teachers, even some military officers were beginning to understand that the banned books contained something their own culture was missing. Day learned about these developments through the few remaining members of his network. Despite the arrests and the constant danger, they continued to meet in new locations. An abandoned mining tunnel one week, an unused storage facility the next. The Empire is getting scared, reported Young Min, a communications worker who had taken Mi Young's place. They are receiving reports from 30 different worlds about humans acting differently, more confident, more questioning of authority. It is not just humans, added Kim. So, a mechanic who had replaced Wu, I heard that some Valeth worlds are asking their government why human literature is so dangerous. If it is just primitive. Nonsense, why do they need so many soldiers to stop it? Day smiled at this news. The Valeth Empire's greatest strength had always been that their citizens never questioned orders. But now, exposed to human stories about freedom and individual worth, some of them were starting to think for themselves. The war was no longer just about smuggling books. It had become a battle for hearts and minds across the galaxy. On one side, stood the Valeth Empire with its weapons and its rigid control. On the other side stood the power of human stories to inspire hope and courage. 3 months after Operation Silent Page began, the first Valeth official publicly criticized the book-banning policy. Council member Dex Vor argued in the Imperial Senate that destroying literature was a sign of weakness, not strength. His speech was broadcast across the Empire before it could be stopped. That night, as Day read from a hand-copied version of Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman, he realized that something fundamental had changed. The Valeth Empire was no longer fighting against a small group of book smugglers. They were fighting against an idea that was spreading faster than they could contain it. The idea that all beings, human or alien, deserved to be free. The literature. War had begun, and for the first time since the occupation started, Day believed that humanity might actually win. 6 months after Operation Silent Page began, the Valeth Empire was facing something it had never encountered in 3,000 years of rule. Not a military rebellion or a political uprising, but something far more dangerous, a revolution of the mind. Han Jun had survived his imprisonment, though he bore the scars of Valeth interrogation methods. After his release, he had not returned to factory work. Instead, he had disappeared into the underground networks that now existed on every human world. His new mission was ambitious and dangerous. He was setting up printing operations. On 12 different worlds, Jun and his allies had established secret printing facilities. They used stolen industrial equipment, modified factory machines, and even hand-built presses constructed from scrap metal. The books they produced were crude and sometimes hard to read, but they carried the same powerful words that had started the revolution. Park Soo-jin had emerged from hiding to lead something unprecedented in the history of human-Valeth relations. Mass peaceful protests. Thousands of human workers would gather in public spaces and simply sit down with books. They would read silently for hours, while Valeth security forces surrounded them. The Valeth did not know how to respond. Their usual tactics of violence and intimidation seemed useless against people who were not fighting, not shouting, not even running away. They were just reading. The protests spread to 17 worlds in the first month alone. Meanwhile, Keth 9 had risen through the ranks of the Valeth bureaucracy. His careful questions about human literature had impressed his superiors, who thought he was conducting thorough research on enemy propaganda. They did not realize he was actually coordinating with the human smuggling networks. Keth 9 now led a faction of reform-minded Valeth officials who were secretly working to change Empire policies. They used their positions to misdirect security sweeps, delay book-burning orders, and protect Valeth citizens who had been caught reading human literature. The transformation was happening faster than anyone had expected. Commander Thexvar stood in his command center on the capital world of Valeth Prime, staring at reports from across the Empire. Red indicators marked worlds where human literature had been discovered. There were now more red lights than green ones on the galactic map. "Sir, we have another problem," reported his aide, Subcommander Yextal. "3 of our patrol ships in the Outer Rim have refused orders to conduct book seizures." Thexvar felt his stomach tighten. "Refused orders? Explain." "The ship commanders claim that destroying literature goes against Valeth military honor codes. They say warriors should not make war on ideas and stories." This was catastrophic news. The Valeth military had always been absolutely obedient. If soldiers were starting to think independently, the entire foundation of the Empire was in danger. "What are they reading?" Thexvar demanded. "Human books about warfare, sir. The Art of War by Sun Tzu. On War by Clausewitz. They claim these books contain superior military wisdom compared to our standard training manuals." Thexvar wanted to rage, but he knew the truth in those words. He had secretly read some human military literature himself. The strategic thinking was indeed impressive, more flexible and creative than traditional Valeth tactics. The reports kept getting worse. On the industrial world of Altair 6, Valeth managers were openly arguing with their superiors about human working conditions. They had read books about labor rights and worker dignity. They wanted to implement better safety standards and fair Wage's daughter. On the research station at Wolf 359, Valeth scientists were requesting permission to collaborate with human researchers. They had discovered that human scientific literature contained breakthrough theories that could advance Valeth technology by decades. Even in the Empire's schools, young Valeth students were asking their teachers why they could not read the books that adults found so threatening. The breaking point came when Emperor Vexthok himself called an emergency session of the Imperial Council. The massive chamber on Valeth Prime had not seen such tension in centuries. Council members who had once agreed on everything were now split into factions. "The human literature problem has become a threat to imperial unity," announced the Emperor, his forearms gesturing dramatically. "I am authorizing the complete extermination of all human worlds. If we cannot control their ideas, we will eliminate their source." The chamber erupted in chaos. Half the council members cheered approval. The other half stood in shocked silence. Council member Dexvor, who had publicly criticized the book-banning policy, stood to speak. "Your Imperial Majesty, we cannot commit genocide against an entire species because of books. The Valeth Empire has always prided itself on being civilized." "Civilized?" Emperor Vexthok's voice echoed through the chamber. "These humans are poisoning our citizens with their primitive emotions. Love, hope, individual freedom. Such concepts make beings weak and disobedient." "Perhaps," interrupted another council member, "these concepts make beings more than just servants and soldiers." The Emperor stared at council member Keth9, who had dared to speak these words. "You forget yourself, Keth9. Beings exist to serve the Empire. That is the natural order." "Is it?" Keth9 pulled out a small book and placed it on his speaking podium. "I have been reading human literature as part of my research. This book is called Letter from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King, Jr. It argues that individuals have a moral duty to disobey unjust laws." Gasps echoed through the chamber. A Valeth official was openly quoting banned human literature in the Imperial Council. "The human king writes about something called conscience," Keth9 continued. "The idea that each being must decide for themselves what is right and wrong, not just follow orders from above." Security guards moved toward Keth9, but other council members stepped in their path. The chamber was dividing into two camps right before the Emperor's eyes. "The humans are right about one thing," declared council member Texiar, a military veteran. "A society that fears books and ideas is a society that has already lost its strength." Emperor Vexthok realized he was facing the collapse of everything he had built. The absolute obedience that had held the Empire together for 3 millennia was crumbling. His own officials were thinking independently, questioning orders, choosing their own moral paths. But the final blow came from an unexpected source. As the council debated, reports arrived that entire Valeth fleet groups had refused orders to begin the human extermination. Ship commanders across the galaxy had read human stories about courage and moral resistance. They could not bring themselves to commit genocide against the species that had taught them about honor and justice. Admiral Kex Thane, the Empire's highest military commander, entered the council chamber with news that would change galactic history. "Your Imperial Majesty," he announced, 60% of our fleet commanders have declared they will not participate in attacks on human civilian populations. Many ships have actually moved to protect human worlds from attack." The Emperor stared at his military leader in complete shock. "They are disobeying direct Imperial orders?" "They claim they are following a higher moral law," Admiral Kexthane replied. "They have been reading human books about just warfare and the protection of innocence." In that moment, Emperor Vexthok realized that his empire was not just facing a rebellion. It was facing a complete transformation of how his people thought about right and wrong, duty and freedom, obedience and conscience. The human books had done what no army could accomplish. They had changed the hearts and minds of the Valeth people themselves. Across the galaxy, Kim Day sat in his hidden shelter and listened to intercepted communications from the Imperial Council. The revolution that had started with a single smuggled book was now threatening to topple the greatest empire in galactic history. The pen had indeed proven mightier than the sword. The abdication announcement came at dawn, broadcast across every world in the galaxy simultaneously. Emperor Vexthok's image appeared on screens in human factories, Valeth government buildings, and alien trading posts throughout the Empire. Citizens of the Valeth Empire, the Emperor began, his voice heavy with exhaustion. For 3,000 years our civilization has been built on order, obedience, and unity of purpose. Today I must acknowledge that this foundation has forever changed. Kim Day watched the broadcast from the main assembly area of New Sol Colony, surrounded by thousands of human workers and their Valeth supervisors. For the first time in decades, both species stood together as equals, listening to the same words. The human literature that we sought to destroy has accomplished something no military force could achieve, Emperor Vexthok continued. It has convinced our own people to choose conscience over command, morality over mere obedience. I cannot rule an empire whose citizens think for themselves. The Emperor paused, and for a moment his composed mask slipped. Perhaps that is as it should be. Effective immediately, I am dissolving the Imperial Council and stepping down from the throne. The worlds of this galaxy must now choose their own paths. The broadcast ended in stunned silence. Then slowly, something remarkable began to happen. Across New Sol Colony, Valeth overseers began removing their weapons and badges of authority. Human workers stood up straighter, no longer bowing their heads in automatic submission. Overseer Vexkar, who had supervised Day's factory for 15 years, walked over to where the human workers were gathered. "I have read your books," he said, quietly. "The ones about treating all beings with dignity and respect. I would like to learn how to do that." It was the beginning of the most peaceful revolution in galactic history. Over the following months, world after world declared independence from the old empire. But instead of fragmenting into chaos, they began forming something new, the Galactic Council of Free Worlds, where humans, Valeth, and dozens of other species worked together as equals. Keth 9 became the first Valeth administrator to serve in a human colony, not as an overseer, but as an elected representative. His first act was to establish public libraries in every settlement. If books can transform an empire, he declared, then every being should have access to them. Park Sujin left her hiding places and became Earth's first ambassador to the reformed Valeth Republic. Her peaceful protests had inspired similar movements across the galaxy. Now she helped negotiate treaties that ensured no species would ever again be enslaved or suppressed. Han Jun's underground printing operations became the foundation for a new industry. The Free Press Publishing Company now operated on 50 worlds, translating human literature into dozens of alien languages. His crude wartime printing presses had evolved into sophisticated facilities that produced millions of books every year. Li Wu survived his imprisonment, though he walked with a permanent limp from Valeth torture methods. After his release, he designed a new type of starship, specifically built for cultural exchange rather than military conquest. The first vessel, named the Anne Frank, carried teachers, artists, and books to remote worlds that had never experienced free exchange of ideas. But the most profound changes were happening in the schools. Children who had grown up under the Empire were now learning together regardless of species. Young humans and Valeth sat side by side, reading the same stories and discussing the same ideas. A generation was growing up that saw beyond the boundaries of race and planet. Day often visited these schools during his travels as the first director of the interspecies library system. His favorite moments came when he watched alien children discover human fairy tales for the first time, their eyes lighting up with the same wonder that human children had always shown. Why did the Emperor think these stories were dangerous? A young Valeth girl asked him during one visit. Day smiled and sat down beside her. Because they taught us that we could be more than what others expected us to be. They showed us that every being, no matter how small or seemingly powerless, has the right to dream of something better. The transformation was not without challenges. Some Valeth hardliners refused to accept the new order and retreated to remote worlds where they tried to maintain the old ways. Some humans struggled to forgive decades of oppression and mistreatment, but the books continued to do their work. Stories about forgiveness helped former enemies become friends. Tales of redemption showed that people could change and grow. Literature about building bridges between different cultures provided practical guidance for the new galactic society. 5 years after the Empire's fall, Day stood in the great library of New Sol, watching the daily miracle of former enemies, learning together. The building had once been a weapons factory. Now its vast halls were filled with books, reading rooms, and quiet conversations between beings from across the galaxy. On the wall above the main entrance, carved in letters 3 feet tall, was a quote from Frederick Douglass. "Once you learn to read, you will be forever free." Below it, in smaller text, was the library's motto: "Here all stories are welcome. Here all dreams are possible." Choi Mi-young had not survived to see this day. She had died in Valeth custody, tortured for information she refused to give. But her sacrifice was remembered. The communication networks that connected libraries across the galaxy were called the Mi-young Relays in her honor. The old Imperial Palace on Valeth Prime had been converted into a museum. Visitors could see the throne room where Emperor Vexthok had made his final speech, and the council chamber where Keth 9 had first quoted Martin Luther King Jr. to challenge imperial authority. But the most popular exhibit was a simple display case containing a worn copy of The Grapes of Wrath, the same book that Day had found in the ruins 40 years ago, the book that had started him on the path to revolution. The museum's guest book was filled with comments from visitors of every species. "Thank you for showing us that ideas can change the world. My children will grow up free because of your courage. Books saved the galaxy." On quiet evenings, Day would return to his old dormitory in New Sol Colony. The building was now a historical site, preserved exactly as it had been during the Empire. Tourists came to see the small room where the book smuggling operation had been planned. But Day came for different reasons. He came to remember the fear and hope that had driven him to risk everything for the power of human stories. He came to honor the friends who had not lived to see freedom. And he came to read. The revolution was over, but the work continued. New worlds were still being discovered, with new species who had never experienced the transformative power of literature. There were still places where books were banned, ideas were suppressed, and beings lived without the freedom to dream. As long as such places existed, there would be smugglers willing to carry books into the darkness. There would be teachers ready to show others that stories could change hearts and minds. There would be believers in the simple truth that words on a page could topple the mightiest empire. Day pulled out a new book from his collection, a volume of poetry by a young Valeth writer who had been inspired by human literature to create something entirely new. As he read verses that blended alien philosophy with human emotion, he smiled. The galaxy had learned the most important lesson that human books could teach. Every being, regardless of species or circumstance, had the right to tell their own story. And when enough beings exercised that right, no force in the universe could keep them enslaved. In the end, the pen had not just proven mightier than the sword, it had proven that some victories were worth more than conquest, and some revolutions were won not by breaking things but by opening minds. The empire of stories had begun, and it would last forever.